The gunshot echoed through the empty streets of Copper Ridge as Gwendolyn Pierce clutched her trembling hands to her chest, tears streaming down her face. The year was 1875, and she had just discovered the most devastating truth. Her husband of 3 years had not only emptied their bank account, but had staged his own death to escape his mounting gambling debts, leaving her alone with their infant daughter and a property on the verge of foreclosure. "How could you, Thomas?" she whispered to the emptiness of their modest home, the farewell letter crumpled in her fist. The man she had trusted with her heart, her future, and her family name had betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. The dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Colorado had once felt like the promise of a new beginning when she'd arrived as a hopeful bride. Now, they seemed to mock her naivety. The townsfolk's pitying glances followed her everywhere. The poor widow Pierce, they thought, unaware that her grief was compounded by humiliation. Only the banker, Mr. Holloway, knew the truth, having shown her the withdrawal slip bearing Thomas's signature dated 3 days after his supposed death. Gwendolyn sat at her kitchen table, little Charlotte asleep in the cradle beside her, and took inventory of her options. The property would be foreclosed in 30 days unless she could produce a miracle. She had her sewing skills, but the town already had a seamstress. What she did have was 20 acres of farmable land and no means to work it. The sound of horses outside drew her attention. Through the window, she saw 3 riders approaching cowboys from the neighboring Triple R ranch. Their foreman, a man known throughout the county for his fairness and hard work, dismounted first. Vaughn Reeves. His tall frame cast a long shadow as he approached her door. She hastily wiped her tears and straightened her apron. Gwendolyn Pierce would not face the world with anything less than dignity, no matter how broken she felt inside. The knock was firm but not demanding. She opened the door to find Vaughn standing respectfully at a distance, hat in hand. His eyes, the deep blue of a mountain lake, met hers directly, something few in town did anymore. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "I've heard about your situation. I've come to make you a business proposition." In that moment, with the afternoon sun highlighting the honest determination in his weathered face, Gwendolyn had no idea that this man would be the one to restore her faith in love and in herself. "Mr. Reeves," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please come in." Vaughn stepped inside, removing his hat out of respect. The 2 men with him remained outside, tending to the horses. Gwendolyn gestured toward the kitchen table, and Vaughn took a seat, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Pierce," he said, his voice low. "I know you're facing foreclosure. And I know that your husband—" He paused, seemingly choosing his words carefully. "My husband abandoned me and my daughter," Gwendolyn finished for him, surprising herself with her candor. "You can speak plainly, Mr. Reeves. The whole town will know soon enough." A flash of surprise crossed his features, followed by something that looked remarkably like respect. "Then I'll be frank. Your land sits at the edge of a water source that would be valuable to the Triple R. The previous owner, your father-in-law, refused to sell or lease it to us. But now, with your situation, you think I'll be desperate enough to sell for less than it's worth," she concluded, her spine stiffening. Vaughn shook his head firmly. "No, madam. That's not my intention at all. What I'm proposing is a partnership. I'd like to work your land, share the profits, and in return, help you keep this property. 50-50 split. I bring the labor and equipment, you provide the land." Gwendolyn blinked, taken aback by the unexpected offer. "Why would you do this? Surely it would be easier to wait for the bank to take it, then buy it at auction." Vaughn's gaze never wavered. "That wouldn't be right. And I'm not in the business of profiting from another's misfortune. The town will talk," she said softly, thinking of the gossip that would surely follow if she entered into business with a single man. "Let them," he replied simply. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. 5 years ago, I was accused of rustling cattle. Spent 3 months in jail before the real culprit was caught. Some folks still look at me sideways." Charlotte stirred in her cradle, and Gwendolyn automatically reached to rock her. "Mr. Reeves, this is a generous offer, but I need time to consider it." "Of course," he said, standing and placing his hat back on his head. "I'll return in 3 days for your answer. In the meantime, I took the liberty of bringing some supplies. My men are unloading them now." Before she could protest, he was at the door. "Mrs. Pierce," he added, turning back, "I want you to know something. Unlike some men, I've always believed in being straightforward. What I'm offering is purely business. No strings, no hidden agendas." After he left, Gwendolyn discovered crates of food, a sack of coffee, and even some fabric for baby clothes on her porch. There was also an envelope containing $50, more than enough to buy her time with the bank. That night, as she stitched a new dress for Charlotte by lamplight, she contemplated Vaughn Reeves' proposition. It seemed too good to be true, and experience had taught her to be wary of men bearing gifts. Yet there had been something in his eyes, something solid and unwavering that made her want to believe him. 3 days later, when he returned as promised, she had her answer ready. "I accept your offer, Mr. Reeves," she said, "but with conditions. We'll draft a proper contract. I want everything in writing." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I would expect nothing less, Mrs. Pierce." And so began an unlikely partnership between a wronged woman fighting for her survival and a cowboy with a reputation to rebuild. The first weeks were awkward. Vaughn and his men arrived each morning at dawn to work the fields, while Gwendolyn maintained a polite distance. She would bring them water and occasionally a meal, but conversation remained minimal and strictly business-related. By the end of the first month, the spring planting was complete. Vaughn had decided on a crop rotation that would maximize their yield: corn, beans, and squash in the traditional companion planting method he'd learned from the local tribes. One evening, as Vaughn was preparing to leave, a sudden thunderstorm broke overhead. The rain came down in sheets, making the trail back to the Triple R treacherous. "You should stay until it passes," Gwendolyn offered, surprising herself. "There's stew on the stove." Vaughn hesitated, aware of how it might appear. "The men have already taken shelter in the barn," she finished for him. "It's just supper, Mr. Reeves. I'm not offering anything improper." Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. "I never thought you were, Mrs. Pierce." They ate in companionable silence, broken only by Charlotte's occasional coos from her cradle. When the baby began to fuss in earnest, Gwendolyn lifted her up, trying to soothe her while simultaneously attempting to finish her meal. "May I?" Vaughn asked, extending his arms. Gwendolyn hesitated only briefly before carefully passing her daughter to him. Vaughn cradled Charlotte with surprising gentleness, his large hands supporting her tiny frame with practiced ease. He began humming a soft melody, and to Gwendolyn's astonishment, Charlotte quieted almost immediately. "You have experience with babies," she observed. "My sister has 5, he explained. "I helped raise the youngest 2 after her husband was killed at Gettysburg." The revelation shifted something in Gwendolyn's perception of him. "You fought in the war?" Vaughn nodded, his expression clouding. "Union cavalry. Came west afterward, like many did. Needed open skies after seeing so much death." Gwendolyn understood the need for new beginnings all too well. "How did you end up in Copper Ridge?" "Followed work. Started as a ranch hand at the Triple R, worked my way up to foreman." He looked down at Charlotte, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "What about you? How did a woman like you end up married to a man like Thomas Pierce?" The question should have offended her, but the lack of judgment in his tone made it impossible to take umbrage. "I was teaching at a girls' school in Boston. Thomas came through on business, charmed me with tales of adventure in the West. I was 21 and had never been anywhere. He promised me a life of excitement and prosperity." She gave a bitter laugh. "I suppose I got the excitement, at least." Vaughn's expression remained neutral, but his eyes reflected understanding rather than pity. "Some men make promises they never intend to keep." "And some men?" she asked softly. Some men, he replied, his gaze steady on hers, believe that a promise made is a debt unpaid until it's fulfilled. The storm continued well past midnight. Gwendolyn insisted that Vaughn take Thomas's old chair by the fire, while she retired to her bedroom with Charlotte. As she drifted off to sleep, she realized it was the first time since Thomas's deception that she had felt something other than fear or anger. It was a small seed of something she couldn't yet name, something fragile but persistent, like the first green shoots pushing through the soil in their newly planted fields. By the time summer arrived, the partnership had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The crops were thriving, and Gwendolyn had managed to negotiate an extension with the bank based on the promising harvest. She had also begun selling baked goods and preserves at the general store, adding a modest but steady income to their enterprise. Vaughn now took his midday meal with her regularly, and sometimes stayed for supper. Their conversations had evolved from polite small talk to genuine exchanges about books, politics, and their hopes for the future. Gwendolyn found herself looking forward to these moments, though she was careful to maintain proper boundaries. The townsfolk, predictably, had begun to gossip. Gwendolyn overheard whispers at church and noticed the sideways glances when she and Vaughn were seen conversing in town. She tried to ignore it, but the weight of public scrutiny was wearing. One Sunday after services, Martha Holloway, the banker's wife, cornered her outside the church. "My dear," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "people are talking about your arrangement with Mr. Reeves. A young widow alone with a child should be more careful of her reputation." Before Gwendolyn could respond, Vaughn appeared at her side. "Mrs. Holloway," he said with deceptive pleasantness, "I couldn't help overhearing your concern for Mrs. Pierce's reputation. It's touching, truly. Almost as touching as your husband's concern for the widows whose mortgages he's foreclosed on ahead of schedule." Martha Holloway's face flushed crimson. "Well, no, madam, I don't imagine you have," Vaughn interrupted smoothly. "Experienced hardship, that is. Mrs. Pierce has, though, and she's facing it with more grace and dignity than most men I know. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have business to discuss." He offered Gwendolyn his arm, which she took after only a moment's hesitation. As they walked away, she fought to suppress a smile. "That was unnecessary," she said when they were out of earshot. "But I cannot pretend I didn't enjoy it." Vaughn's expression was unapologetic. "I don't abide bullies, Mrs. Pierce. Not even those wearing Sunday bonnets." His defense of her stirred something warm in Gwendolyn's chest, but she pushed the feeling aside. She couldn't afford to develop tender feelings for anyone, especially not a man who was, first and foremost, her business partner. July brought a heatwave that threatened the crops. For 2 weeks, Vaughn and his men worked from dawn until well past dusk, hauling water from the creek to irrigate the fields. Gwendolyn joined the effort, leaving Charlotte with Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly neighbor who was happy for the company. On the hottest day, as the sun beat down mercilessly, Gwendolyn was carrying water alongside Vaughn when she suddenly felt lightheaded. The bucket slipped from her grasp, and she would have fallen if Vaughn hadn't caught her. "That's enough," he said firmly, leading her to the shade of an oak tree. "You're done for today." "I'm fine," she protested weakly. "The crops will survive," he finished. "You're no good to them or to Charlotte if you collapse from heat stroke." He pressed the canteen to her lips, and she drank gratefully. His hand rested on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. When she looked up, his face was closer than she expected, concern etched in every line. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that made her breath catch. Then, as if remembering himself, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Rest here," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'll send one of the men to escort you back to the house." Before she could respond, he was gone, striding back to the fields with long, purposeful steps. Gwendolyn leaned against the tree trunk, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. That evening, Vaughn didn't stay for supper as had become his custom. The next day, he was polite but distant, issuing instructions to his men and then riding off to check on another part of the Triple R's operation. The pattern continued for several days, leaving Gwendolyn confused, and, she was surprised to realize, hurt by his sudden withdrawal. It wasn't until a week later, when a sudden summer storm forced him to seek shelter in her kitchen once again, that they were alone together long enough to address the change. "Have I offended you in some way, Mr. Reeves?" she asked directly as they sat at the table, listening to the rain pound against the roof. Vaughn looked up from his coffee, surprise evident in his expression. "No, madam. Not at all." "Then why have you been avoiding me?" He was silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the mug. Finally, he met her gaze. "Because I made a promise to myself when we started this partnership. That I would keep things strictly business. That I wouldn't—" He stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "Wouldn't what?" she pressed. "Wouldn't complicate things with feelings that have no place in our arrangement," he finished, his voice low. Gwendolyn felt her cheeks warm. "I see. Do you?" he asked, suddenly intent. "Because I'm not sure I do. All I know is that I find myself thinking about you when I should be focusing on cattle prices. I catch myself making excuses to come by even when there's no business to discuss. And that day under the oak tree I nearly—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Nearly what?" she whispered. The look he gave her was so naked in its longing that it took her breath away. "Nearly forgot every promise I made about keeping my distance. About not being just another man who makes demands on you when you've already been through enough." Gwendolyn felt something unfurl inside her chest, a cautious hope she had thought long buried. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "I don't need quite as much distance as you think." The words hung between them, charged with possibility. Vaughn's expression shifted from surprise to a guarded hope of his own. But before he could respond, Charlotte's cries from the bedroom shattered the moment. "I should check on her," Gwendolyn said, rising quickly. Vaughn nodded, standing as well. "And I should get back to the ranch. The storm's letting up." They parted awkwardly, both aware that something fundamental had changed between them, but neither quite ready to define what that might mean. August brought the first harvest, and with it, a modest profit that allowed Gwendolyn to make her mortgage payment with money to spare. The day she returned from the bank, receipt in hand, she found Vaughn waiting on her porch with a small wooden object. "What's this?" she asked as he handed it to her. "A music box," he explained. "For Charlotte. My father made it for my sister's first child, and she passed it down to me. I thought, well, every child should have something special." Gwendolyn turned the beautifully carved box in her hands, then opened the lid. A sweet, simple melody began to play, the same tune Vaughn had hummed to Charlotte that first night during the storm. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched. "But I can't accept something so personal, so valuable. You can," he interrupted gently. "Because it's not just for Charlotte. It's for you too. A reminder that some things can be passed down with love, not just obligation or deceit." The thoughtfulness of the gift, and the meaning behind it, made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she managed, clutching the box close. Vaughn reached out hesitantly, then brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was feather light, but it sent a current through her that was impossible to ignore. "Gwendolyn," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I've been thinking about what you said. About distance." The sound of approaching horses interrupted him. 3 riders were coming up the road, one of them Sheriff Davis, his expression grim. Vaughn stepped protectively in front of Gwendolyn as the men approached. "Sheriff," he greeted cautiously. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Davis dismounted, his gaze moving between them before settling on Gwendolyn. "Mrs. Pierce, I'm afraid I have some news. Your husband has been spotted in Denver." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "That's impossible," she said faintly. "Thomas is dead." The sheriff's expression was sympathetic but firm. No, madam. He's very much alive. And he's been arrested for fraud and theft. The Denver authorities contacted me because they found papers indicating he still has property here. This property. Gwendolyn felt Vaughn's hand on her elbow, steadying her. What does this mean for Mrs. Pierce? He asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. It means, the sheriff said heavily, that legally Thomas Pierce still has claim to this land and everything on it. Unless Mrs. Pierce can prove otherwise. He abandoned us, Gwendolyn said, finding her voice at last. He emptied our accounts and left me and our daughter with nothing. And that's why I'm here unofficially first, Sheriff Davis replied. To warn you that he's claiming you knew about his plan. That you helped him stage his death to avoid creditors, and that any hardship you've suffered was your own choice. The audacity of the lie stole her breath. Beside her, she felt Vaughn go rigid with fury. That's absurd, he growled. No one who knows Mrs. Pierce would believe such a thing. I agree, the sheriff said. But the law doesn't always concern itself with what we know to be true. Only what can be proven. He sighed, adjusting his hat. He'll be transferred here for trial next week. Until then, I'd suggest you speak with a lawyer, Mrs. Pierce. After the sheriff and his deputies rode away, Gwendolyn sank onto the porch steps, the music box still clutched in her hands. He's alive, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. All this time, while I grieved, while I struggled, while I feared for our daughter's future, he was alive. Vaughn sat beside her, close but not touching. What do you need? He asked simply. She looked at him then, this man who had become so much more than a business partner in the months they had known each other. I need to fight, she said, her voice growing stronger. I need to protect what's mine, what's Charlotte's. And I need. She hesitated, then continued with renewed determination. I need you to know that whatever happens, what has grown between us is real. It's not gratitude or convenience or desperation. It's something I never expected to feel again, especially not after Thomas's betrayal. Vaughn's eyes, always so direct, held hers with an intensity that made her heart race. I believe you, he said. And I want you to know that I'll stand by you through this. Not because of our business arrangement, but because, he took a deep breath. Because I've been falling in love with you, Gwendolyn Pierce. Slowly, carefully, against my better judgment. And I've been honest about that from the start, even when I was trying to deny it to myself. The declaration hung in the air between them, as momentous as a thunderclap. Gwendolyn felt something bloom in her chest, something warm and bright that pushed back against the cold dread Thomas's reappearance had brought. Vaughn, she began, but was interrupted by Charlotte's cries from inside the house. He stood, offering her his hand. Tend to your daughter. We'll talk more when you're ready. I'll ride into town now and speak with Judge Wilson about your legal options. She took his hand, allowing him to help her up. Before he could step away, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for being the kind of man who keeps his promises. The week that followed was a blur of legal consultations and preparations. Judge Wilson, a fair-minded man who had never approved of Thomas Pierce's high-handedness, agreed to represent Gwendolyn. Together with Vaughn, they gathered evidence of Thomas's abandonment and fraud, bank records, witnessed statements from townspeople who had seen him withdraw their funds, even the letter he had left behind. Meanwhile, Gwendolyn faced the town's renewed interest in her situation with a dignity that earned her respect. When asked about the rumors, she answered simply, My husband abandoned his family and his responsibilities. I have rebuilt my life without him. Whatever the law decides about our property, nothing can change those facts. Vaughn remained a constant presence, though he was careful to maintain propriety given the delicate situation. He continued working the land but refrained from staying for meals or extended conversations that might fuel gossip. Nevertheless, his support was unwavering, and Gwendolyn drew strength from knowing he was nearby. The day Thomas was scheduled to arrive, Gwendolyn dressed with particular care in her best blue dress, the one she had sewn herself from fabric Vaughn had brought from Denver months ago. She arranged her hair neatly and pinned her mother's cameo at her throat. Whatever happened, she would face her husband with the dignity he had never afforded her. Vaughn met her at the edge of town, his expression concerned. "You don't have to be here for this," he said. "Judge Wilson and I can handle it." Gwendolyn straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I do. I need to look him in the eye. I need him to see that he didn't break me." The admiration in Vaughn's gaze warmed her. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known, Gwendolyn Pierce." "Not yet," she replied with a small smile. "But I'm learning." They walked together to the sheriff's office, where a small crowd had already gathered in anticipation of the arrival. Judge Wilson was waiting for them, his weathered face set in determined lines. "Remember," he advised, "say nothing directly to him. Let me do the talking." Gwendolyn nodded, though her heart was pounding so loudly she wondered if the others could hear it. Vaughn stood at her side, a solid, reassuring presence. The sound of horses announced the arrival of the prison transport. Sheriff Davis emerged first, followed by two deputies, and between them, a man Gwendolyn had once pledged her life to. Thomas Pierce looked thinner than she remembered, his once immaculate clothing now dusty and worn. But the arrogant tilt of his chin was unchanged, as was the calculating look in his eyes as they swept over the crowd and landed on her. "Gwendolyn," he called, his voice carrying across the street. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding, darling. Tell these men who I am." She felt Vaughn tense beside her but kept her gaze steady on Thomas. "I know exactly who you are," she replied, her voice clear and carrying. "A liar and a thief who abandoned his wife and child." Thomas's expression hardened. "Now, that's hardly fair. I was protecting our assets from creditors. It was a temporary measure that lasted over a year." Judge Wilson interrupted, stepping forward. "During which time you made no attempt to contact your wife or provide for your child. During which time you were seen gambling in Denver saloons while Mrs. Pierce nearly lost her home?" Thomas's eyes narrowed as he took in the judge, then Vaughn standing protectively at Gwendolyn's side. A calculating smile spread across his face. "I see how it is. My wife has found comfort in my absence. Tell me, Gwendolyn, how long did you wait before inviting another man into my bed?" Vaughn surged forward, but Gwendolyn caught his arm. "He's not worth it," she said softly, before turning back to Thomas. "Your accusations only reveal your own character, Thomas. Mr. Reeves has been a business partner and a friend when I needed both. He has shown more honor as a friend than you ever did as a husband." Sheriff Davis intervened then, pushing Thomas toward the jailhouse door. "That's enough. Save it for the judge, Pierce." As Thomas was led inside, he called back over his shoulder. "This isn't over, Gwendolyn. That's still my property, and she's still my wife. Remember that, Cowboy." The door closed behind them, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. Gradually, the crowd dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves. Judge Wilson approached Gwendolyn and Vaughn with a grave expression. "That went about as well as could be expected," he said. "The trial is set for tomorrow. Be prepared, he'll try to paint you as an unfaithful wife who conspired against him. We need to focus on the evidence of fraud and abandonment." After the judge left, Gwendolyn and Vaughn walked slowly back toward her property, both lost in thought. The tension of the confrontation had left her drained, but also strangely liberated. Seeing Thomas again had confirmed what she already knew. Whatever love she had once felt for him was gone, replaced by a calm determination to protect herself and Charlotte. "Are you all right?" Vaughn asked as they reached her fence line. She considered the question seriously. "Yes," she finally answered. "Seeing him was difficult, but not in the way I expected. I felt nothing. No love, no hate. Just a determination to be free of him once and for all." Vaughn's expression was carefully neutral. "And his accusations? About us?" Gwendolyn turned to face him fully. were the desperate tactics of a man who knows he's losing. Nothing more. But there is something between us, Vaughn said quietly. Something I won't deny, even if the timing is complicated. Yes, she admitted, her heart racing. There is. And once this is over, he interrupted gently, we'll have time to explore what that means. Without his shadow hanging over us. The trial began the following morning in the town's small courthouse. It seemed all of Copper Ridge had turned out to witness the proceedings, filling the benches and spilling out into the street. Gwendolyn sat at the front with Judge Wilson, while Vaughn sat directly behind her, a silent pillar of support. Thomas, cleaned up and dressed in borrowed clothes that restored some of his former polish, played the role of the misunderstood husband to perfection. He claimed that he had been forced to flee due to threats from creditors, that he had always intended to return once he had rebuilt their fortune, that the money he took was rightfully his as the head of the household. When it was Gwendolyn's turn to testify, she did so with a composure that impressed even the skeptical judge. She presented the letter Thomas had left, detailing the bank records that showed he had emptied their accounts days after his supposed death, and explained how she had nearly lost everything before establishing her partnership with the Triple R Ranch. And this partnership? Thomas's hastily appointed lawyer asked during cross-examination. With Mr. Reeves. It's purely business? Gwendolyn met his gaze steadily. Mr. Reeves offered me a fair business arrangement when I had few options. He has been honorable in all our dealings. But you've been seen dining together, spending time together outside of business hours, the lawyer pressed. We have developed a friendship, she acknowledged. Which is more than can be said for my husband, who left me to believe he was dead while he gambled away our savings in Denver. A murmur of approval ran through the courtroom, and the lawyer quickly changed tactics. The most damning testimony came from Mr. Holloway, the banker, who reluctantly admitted under oath that Thomas had withdrawn their entire savings 3 days after his supposed death, telling Holloway that Gwendolyn had sent him to collect the funds for a family emergency. By the end of the day, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. The judge, after hearing all the evidence, declared that he would announce his decision the following morning. That night, Gwendolyn sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the fields gold. The crops were nearly ready for the second harvest, crops she and Vaughn had planted together, nurtured together. Whatever the judge decided, she took pride in what they had built. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. Vaughn dismounted, leading his horse up the path. I thought you might like some company, he said. If that's all right. She smiled, gesturing to the space beside her on the porch step. It's more than all right. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the colors fade from the sky. Finally Vaughn spoke. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. Gwendolyn turned to him, noting the serious set of his jaw. What is that? That meeting you changed my life, he said simply. Before you, I was just existing, working, sleeping, moving through each day without really living it. You woke something in me that I thought was gone for good. Touched beyond words, Gwendolyn reached for his hand. You did the same for me. After Thomas left, I was drowning in betrayal and fear. You threw me a lifeline, and then taught me to swim on my own again. His fingers tightened around hers. If the judge rules in your favor tomorrow, what will you do? The question was loaded with unspoken meaning. Gwendolyn considered it carefully. I'll continue building a life for Charlotte and myself. I'll keep working this land. She took a deep breath. And I'll explore this feeling between us, if you're willing. And if he rules in Thomas's favor? She squared her shoulders. Then I'll fight in different ways. I won't stay married to him, no matter what the law initially says. I'll petition for divorce on grounds of abandonment. I'll start over somewhere else if I have to. You wouldn't have to do it alone, Vaughn said, his voice low and intense. I meant what I said, Gwendolyn. I love you. I've been honest about that from the start, even when I was trying to deny it to myself. And if you'll have me, I'd stand by you through whatever comes next." The declaration, so simply stated yet so profound, brought tears to her eyes. "I believe you," she whispered. "And that's a gift beyond measure after what I've been through." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a tear from her cheek. "May I?" he asked, his intention clear. She nodded, her heart pounding as he leaned in and kissed her gently at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. It was nothing like Thomas's kisses had been. There was no demand in it, no taking, only a mutual giving that left her breathless. When they parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever the judge decides tomorrow," he said softly, "remember that you're not alone anymore." The courthouse was even more crowded the next morning as everyone gathered to hear the judge's decision. Thomas sat at one table, looking confident despite the evidence against him. Gwendolyn sat at the other with Judge Wilson, her expression calm despite the riot of emotions inside her. Vaughn had come early to secure a seat directly behind her again. His presence was a comfort she could feel even without turning to look at him. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. He was a stern man, known for his adherence to the letter of the law, but also for his sense of fundamental fairness. He surveyed the room slowly before speaking. "This case," he began, "presents unusual circumstances. On one hand, we have a husband who, by all evidence, abandoned his family and engaged in fraudulent behavior. On the other hand, we have legal precedents regarding marital property that cannot be entirely disregarded." Gwendolyn's heart sank. It sounded as though he was preparing to rule in Thomas's favor despite everything. "Mr. Pierce," the judge continued, turning to Thomas, "your actions were reprehensible. You left your wife and child destitute, allowed them to believe you were dead, and absconded with funds that, while legally under your control as head of the household, were morally intended for the support of your family." Thomas shifted uncomfortably but maintained his confident expression. "Mrs. Pierce," the judge said, turning to Gwendolyn, "you have conducted yourself with dignity and resourcefulness in the face of extraordinary challenges. You have maintained the property, entered into a productive business arrangement, and provided for your child without assistance from the man who vowed to protect and support you." He paused, looking between them. "After careful consideration of both legal precedent and the unique facts of this case, I have reached the following decision. The property and all assets currently in Mrs. Pierce's possession will remain under her control. Mr. Pierce's abandonment and fraudulent behavior constitute a forfeiture of his marital rights to said property." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Gwendolyn barely dared to breathe. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am granting Mrs. Pierce's petition for divorce on grounds of abandonment and fraud, to be finalized immediately. Mr. Pierce will remain in custody to face charges of bank fraud and false reporting of his own death." The courtroom erupted in conversation. Gwendolyn sat in stunned silence, barely able to comprehend that it was over, that she had won not just the property, but her freedom. Thomas stood abruptly, his face contorted with rage. "This is an outrage. She's my wife. That's my property." "Not anymore," the judge said firmly. "Sheriff, please remove Mr. Pierce from my courtroom." As Thomas was led away, still protesting, Gwendolyn turned to find Vaughn watching her, his eyes bright with emotion. She allowed herself a small, private smile meant only for him, a promise of the conversation to come. Outside the courthouse, townspeople approached to offer congratulations. Even Mrs. Holloway, chastened by her husband's reluctant testimony against Thomas, offered a stiff nod of acknowledgement. Judge Wilson shook Gwendolyn's hand, promising to file the final divorce papers that afternoon. "You're a free woman, Mrs. Pierce," he said. "Or perhaps you'll want to return to your maiden name now?" "Gwendolyn Hayes," she said, trying the sound of it. "Yes, I think it's time to reclaim that part of myself." It wasn't until late afternoon that she and Vaughn finally had a moment alone. He had accompanied her home, helping to field the well-wishers who had stopped by with food and congratulations, and had stayed to fix a loose board on her porch while she put Charlotte down for a nap. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the fields they had tended together, Gwendolyn brought 2 glasses of lemonade outside to where Vaughn was putting away his tools. "Thank you," she said, handing him a glass. "Not just for the porch, but for everything." He accepted the drink, his fingers brushing hers in a touch that sent warmth through her despite its brevity. "You won your freedom on your own merits, Gwendolyn. I just stood by you while you fought. That's more than most would have done," she replied. "And it meant everything to me." They sipped their lemonade in companionable silence for a moment before Vaughn spoke again. "Last night," he began carefully, "before we knew how things would turn out, I told you how I feel. I want you to know that hasn't changed now that the circumstances have." Gwendolyn set down her glass and turned to face him fully. "I'm glad," she said softly, "because my feelings haven't changed either." Hope flared in his eyes. "And what exactly are those feelings, Gwendolyn Hayes?" She smiled at his use of her reclaimed name. "That I've come to love you, Vaughn Reeves. Slowly, carefully, against my better judgment, just as you said. That you've shown me what a true partner looks like, in business and in life. And that I'd like to explore what that could mean for us, if you're still willing." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'm more than willing," he said, setting down his own glass and taking her hands in his. "I've been waiting to hear those words since the day I realized I was falling in love with you. I needed time," she acknowledged, "to heal, to find my own strength again." "And I would have given you all the time in the world," he replied. "Some things are worth waiting for." This time, it was Gwendolyn who closed the distance between them, rising on her toes to press her lips to his in a kiss that held both promise and certainty. His arms came around her, strong and steady, making her feel both protected and powerful in her own right. When they parted, she looked up at him with a smile that felt as fresh and hopeful as the new crops in their fields. "So what happens now?" she asked. Vaughn tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. "Now we take it one day at a time. We continue our partnership both kinds. We build something lasting, if that's what you want." "It is," she said simply. "More than anything." As twilight descended over Copper Ridge, Gwendolyn and Vaughn sat on her porch, planning their future together, a future built on honesty, mutual respect, and a love that had grown from the most unlikely of partnerships. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day with the mountains blazing with fall colors, Gwendolyn Hayes became Gwendolyn Reeves in a simple ceremony behind the house they now shared. Charlotte, now walking and babbling happily, served as an enthusiastic if somewhat distracted flower girl, toddling down a path strewn with late-blooming wildflowers. The entire town turned out for the celebration, their earlier gossip forgotten in the face of such obvious happiness. Even Mrs. Holloway brought a cake, a silent peace offering that Gwendolyn accepted with grace. Judge Wilson performed the ceremony, his usually stern face softened with genuine pleasure as he pronounced them husband and wife. As Vaughn kissed his bride, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. The reception lasted well into the evening, with lanterns illuminating the yard and fiddle music inspiring impromptu dancing. As twilight deepened, Vaughn drew Gwendolyn away from the celebration to a quiet corner of the porch. "Happy?" he asked, his arms around her waist. She looked up at him, this man who had started as a business partner and become the love of her life. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "A wedding gift." Curious, Gwendolyn opened the pouch and tipped its contents into her palm. A delicate gold locket gleamed in the lantern light, its surface etched with intertwining vines. "Open it," Vaughn encouraged. Inside was a tiny portrait of Charlotte on one side. The other held a small pressed wildflower, the same kind that had been blooming the day he'd first come to propose their business partnership. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely touched. "I wanted you to have something to remind you of our beginning," he explained, "and our future." He took the locket from her palm and carefully fastened it around her neck. I meant what I said that day, you know. I've been honest from the start. I love you, Gwendolyn Reeves. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it. She reached up to touch the locket, then laid her hand against his cheek. You already prove it every day, she said softly. With every action, every word, every promise kept. As they rejoined the celebration, Gwendolyn reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the desperate young widow facing foreclosure to the confident woman who had rebuilt her life on her own terms. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of everything had instead been the beginning of something far more precious and true. And as Vaughn swept her into a dance, his eyes never leaving hers, she knew with absolute certainty that this was what love was supposed to be: not possession or control, but partnership and truth. A shared journey built on mutual respect and unwavering honesty. I love you, she whispered as they moved across the makeshift dance floor. I know, he replied with that half-smile she had come to cherish. I've always known, even before you did. 5 years later, the property once known as the Pierce place had transformed into the thriving Reeves family ranch. The original 20 acres had expanded to 50 through careful investment of their profits, and what had begun as a desperate business arrangement had grown into one of the most prosperous operations in the county. Charlotte, now 6 years old and the spitting image of her mother, had been joined by 3-year-old twins, James and Joseph, who had inherited their father's blue eyes and steady temperament. A new addition was expected in the spring, and Gwendolyn's gently rounded belly was a source of pride for Vaughn, who took every opportunity to dote on his expanding family. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Vaughn and Gwendolyn made it a tradition to have a private supper after the children were asleep. This year, they sat on the expanded porch of their home, watching the stars emerge over land that had witnessed both their greatest challenges and most profound joys. Do you ever think about him? Vaughn asked quietly, his hand finding hers in the gathering darkness. Gwendolyn didn't need to ask who he meant. Rarely, she admitted. Sometimes I wonder what became of him after he served his sentence. But it's a passing thought, nothing more. Thomas Pierce had indeed served 2 years for his crimes before being released. Last they had heard, he had headed west to California, where gold fever was still drawing opportunists of all stripes. He gave me Charlotte, she continued, and for that, I can almost be grateful to him. But what we have built here, she gestured to encompass not just the property but the life they had created together. That is entirely ours. Vaughn nodded, understanding as always. I was thinking today about that first time I rode up to your door. Did you know that I'd been watching your property for weeks before I finally approached you? She turned to him in surprise. You never told me that. He smiled, a touch of sheepishness in his expression. I'd seen you in town, heard about your situation. I knew the land was valuable, knew you were struggling. But I couldn't bring myself to take advantage of that. So what changed? Why did you finally come that day? I saw you in the general store, he recalled. You were counting pennies to buy flour, but you also bought a small toy for Charlotte. That's when I knew you were someone I wanted to do business with, someone who would sacrifice for others but still find ways to bring joy, even in hard times. Touched by the memory, Gwendolyn leaned against his shoulder. And now look at us. Now look at us, he agreed, wrapping an arm around her. Partners in every sense of the word. As the night deepened around them, Gwendolyn reflected on the path that had led her here, from the naive young woman who had followed a charming liar west, to the woman who had found both her strength and true love in the aftermath of betrayal. The music box Vaughn had given her years ago still played in Charlotte's room, its sweet melody now a lullaby for all their children. The locket he had presented on their wedding day still hung around her neck, now containing portraits of all their children on one side, and the same pressed wildflower on the other, a reminder of beginnings and the beauty that can grow from even the harshest circumstances. What are you thinking? Vaughn asked, noticing her contemplative mood. She smiled up at him, this man who had taught her what honest love looked like. I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones. That if Thomas hadn't lied and left, I might never have found you. And I might never have found the courage to tell you how I felt, he admitted. To say those words that changed everything. I've been honest from the start. I love you. She finished for him, quoting the declaration that had begun their journey from business partners to husband and wife. As they sat together under the vast Colorado sky, surrounded by the life they had built through partnership, perseverance, and unwavering honesty, Gwendolyn knew that she had found something far more valuable than the security she had once sought in marriage to Thomas Pierce. She had found a love built on truth, a partnership founded on respect, and a family created through choice rather than obligation. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the fields they had planted together. Vaughn drew her closer, his hand resting protectively over the new life growing within her. I love you, Gwendolyn Reeves, he said simply, the words as true now as they had been the first time he'd spoken them. And I love you, she replied, knowing with absolute certainty that some promises were meant to be kept and some truths, once spoken, became the foundation upon which entire lives could be built. The moon rose over their home, illuminating the land that had witnessed both her greatest despair and her most profound joy. And in that moment, with her husband beside her and their children sleeping peacefully inside, Gwendolyn knew that she had found what she had always truly sought, not just security or passion or even companionship, but a love honest enough to weather any storm and strong enough to rebuild from any betrayal. A love that, unlike the false promises of her past, would stand the test of time.